Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Kamsky-Fowler and thank you for joining me for this leadership development module. Today we're going to be talking about strengths-focused change. We're going to talk a little bit about the change process, how that happens. We're going to talk about the SWITCH framework, which is another of the wonderful frameworks developed by Chip and Dan Heath. And then we're going to talk very briefly about finding and leveraging your bright spots in your organization. How do we make change? Change is such an interesting thing. We have to do it. We have to adapt. Sometimes it's slow adaptation. Other times it's major change. The question, though, is how does that happen? And I think that we need to start right up front by saying that change often produces fear. And so I'm going to ask you just to reflect. We don't need to stop the video, but I want you to reflect just quietly for a moment about, do you think that the people we lead are really afraid of change? And if we do, what is the source of that fear? What is it they're actually afraid of? Is it the change or is it something else? Now, I put that picture on the slide because one of the challenges that we have sometimes when we discuss change and fear of change is that we ultimately feed the fear of change. Remember, we talked about those background conversations with the scarcity and I'm not enough, and we've discussed our tendency to always be noticing when there's risk. So we're biologically predisposed to notice and hang on to risk. So if we discuss all the things that can be a problem in change, we're feeding the fear. So let's get really smart about how we think about discussing change. I'm going to ask you now to take about 5 minutes and let me walk you through the exercise, and then you can press pause and get to your discussion. Before you start talking, I want you to sit just quietly for a few seconds. You can decide, the facilitator can decide how long that's going to be. And I want you to think about a change that you faced in your professional life that caused you to feel afraid or anxious. So you'll need to think about it and identify it and just sit with it for a second, and you'll notice how that makes you feel. Now I want you to think about, what was it that you were really concerned about? What was it that actually was causing your fear? If you have the time, facilitators will give you a chance to sort of discuss that amongst yourselves before we start back up. If you don't have a lot of time, then have the conversation and then come back and I'll join you. I think what we really fear with change is the unknown. I've got this road in the fog, and we know how anxious we feel when even if it's a familiar road. We could be driving a road that we drive regularly, but on a night when it's dark and there's heavy fog, even skilled drivers driving a familiar road feel fear and anxiety, and that's appropriate. Because now we can't see where we're going. The road is clear, the path is clear, the destination is not clear. And that's what's frightening. And so this is also a good analogy, because what's changed here is, I know that I'm going from work to home, but what's changed is something in the middle. And actually, William Bridges talks about this in his book, The Bridges Model, that what we really fear is the transition from getting from where we are here to where we're going to be there. We also fear giving up the familiar for the unknown. Sometimes this can be a way of doing business. It can even be a colleague or anything. But even if we don't particularly like it, it's familiar. It's not threatening. The unknown could be wonderful, but our brain is not trained or designed to have us assume that it will be wonderful. We tend to assume that it will be a problem. And then we have a hard time weighing giving up what we know for things that are potentially ambiguous or uncertain. And here is where we learn to bring ourselves to this process with curiosity. And I will record a module for you on this, which is about how do you approach a change process so that instead of having it all be unknown and then we judge it, that you actually bring yourself to this change process expecting to learn on every step of the journey. And then there is a very real fear in any change that we may lose something. We may lose colleagues, we may lose resources, we may lose authority, we may lose job satisfaction. And so we have to confront the fact that this is a very strong emotional process when we embark on change. And the skill that leaders use to really address it is firstly to have people understand why we're changing and what their role will be, but also to communicate constantly through many different channels during the change process itself. And so one of the key skills for leaders, and I've put here of positive culture change, because you can change culture and you can change things in a way as a leader that are not at all positive. So we're talking about changing things positively, is that we need to understand and define the role of people in the change process and understand how that plays out. And the model that I like the best for this, in terms of understanding the relative relationships in change, is the Heath Brothers switch framework. Their books are wonderful. They've always got a picture that, like, this is a light switch. And they have drawn on the work of change leaders from around the world to develop a very simple framework for guiding our thinking about change. And once again, that resource is available to you. They have 3 basic principles. They say you've got to find the feeling, you have to grow the people, and you have to shrink the change. In other words, the feeling is what's going to be the emotional connection to the need to change. We have to give people the skills and the support they need to make the change. And wherever possible, we want to make change as small as possible. So even if that means dividing it into phases or stages. But their model is really kind of fun. When they talk about making a switch, they say, well, we have a rider, we have an elephant, and we have a path that the elephant has to travel under the direction of the rider. So the rider in the change process is the intellectual and rational component of change. This is the why we need to make the change, what needs to change, by when, what are some of the strategies we're going to do. So this is the rational, intellectual piece of initiating change or deciding about change. Now, what about the elephant? Well, the elephant is the emotional and motivational part of change. So I may be the rider, even if I'm trying to change myself. I may be the rider and I intellectually know why I want to make a change, but my elephant is like, it's hard. So when my alarm goes off at 5 o'clock in the morning, because I know intellectually that I'm going to go and exercise because it's good for me, it manages my stress, and it's all those things we know. My elephant is like, oh, but Carolyn, I'm so tired and I don't have the energy, and what could I do with 15 minutes more sleep, right? So this is, we can actually be our own elephant as well as the rider. And then we shape the path, and that is how we shape the physical and the social environment to make this journey easier. So, the fact that you have somebody who goes for a walk with you at lunchtime, or the fact that the first thing you see when you open your eyes are your exercise shoes, whatever that is, we can learn to make the path easier for the work that we do. And I'm going to take you through these stages one by one. In the rider, the work of leading change through the work of directing the rider, there are several steps, but I'm going to stop on the first step in directing the rider. And that is that you have to follow the bright spots. Now, if you haven't watched the module where we discuss positive deviance yet, this relates to the work of Jerry Sternan and positive deviance. And what we mean by the bright spots is that in every situation, there are people who are just positively deviant. Now, deviant doesn't sound like a great word, but it's actually, they're sort of divergent. So in other words, they're separating from the pack. And I'm not going to take a lot of time to explain this because we explain it in another module, but just so you know, essentially what positive deviance is saying is that in every situation with the same conditions, the same circumstances, and often the same resources, there are people and situations that just do better. So in a hospital setting, we know that there are positive deviance work has been done for hand hygiene in hospitals. We can spend a lot of time focusing on the people who don't comply and don't wash their hands, or in low-performing units, but there is much, much more to be learned from the units that are the high performers and where compliance is high. Because if in the midst of this craziness that is their reality in healthcare, they've found a way to make it happen, there's a lot to learn from them. So one of the ways to focus on blind spots, on bright spots, is to replace the fear of the unknown with curiosity about what's going well. The other question that is used a lot in positive deviance is the use of the somersault question. So, for example, Jerry Sternen's work was on malnutrition in Vietnam, with children dying and unable to be well nourished. And they were spending a lot of time asking what he called true but useless questions about what all the problems were and what all the things were that were going to get in the way of them changing the children's well-being. But the somersault question that changed their work was, is it possible that kids who live in this village are healthy and thriving? And people said, well, gosh, yes, they are. They are thriving. And so the question was, well, why? What are they doing differently? What are they using? What are they embracing? Or what are they rejecting? What are they not accepting in terms of conventional wisdom that has them able to keep their children healthy and thriving? And so this is what we mean when we say follow the bright spots. And I want you to pause here and take a few minutes, depending on how long you have, to think about if you wanted to identify the bright spots either in your team, in your program, or within Office of Healthcare Quality. How would you go about that? And I'll join you again in a few minutes. So now that you've had some great ideas about how to find the bright spots, and actually they're not that hard to find, the next pieces that he talks about are scripting the critical moves and pointing to the destination. So we are going to start looking for bright spots, opportunities, things that are going well. And we're wanting to point to the achievement of that. So we know now that we actually have people who get it, and so we know it's possible because we have our bright spots. And we've learned about what it is that they're doing differently. So maybe we have somebody at OHCQ who is really superb at holding underperforming colleagues accountable in a way that is respectful and constructive and helps that colleague grow and perform to their potential, right? So then what we would want to learn is, well, what are the critical pieces? If our goal is that we want to be able to be there and doing that, what are the critical steps we need to follow? What are the things that we're going to have to do to get ourselves into a position where we can move this forward? Now, the next step in this change process is to motivate the elephant. And this is the emotional piece of it. And let me just say here, I can't do justice to their work. If you want to read this book, it's a wonderful book, and there are all sorts of resources on the website to help you learn more about this. But I just want to pause here and say that when I taught a graduate leadership course in the School of Nursing, this is the textbook that I used. So the first part in motivating the elephant is to find the feeling. What do people care about? What would be meaningful to people? What would motivate them to go on this journey with you? What do they care about? And very often this is their values. We care about accountability. We care about honesty. We care about integrity. We care about resilience and hope. And we care about respect, for example. These are the values of the leadership cohort. And then we want to shrink the change. So you've always heard these stories, I'm sure, that, if your goal is to exercise for, 30 minutes a day, 7 days a week, or 6 days a week, and you don't exercise now, you're not going to try to go from not exercising to exercising 30 minutes every day. You may say, you know what, I'm going to take a 10-minute walk after dinner 3 times a week. Or on my lunch hour, I'm going to go and walk around campus. Do that once a week, twice a week, right? That's the way we do it. So especially if we have complex change rolling out, we might want to think about, is it possible to phase it or stage it so people get familiar with each of the pieces of the change, as opposed to having to deal with this huge bite that they're going to choke on. And then we have to grow our people. I mean, we can't motivate people to do things without also supporting them in their ability to do it. That's not fair. That's setting them up to fail. And very often, people fear failure. I fear that I'm not going to be able to handle this new technology or this new responsibility. And so part of motivating the elephant is not just to say, oh, you'll be great, don't worry, you'll be fine. That's not fair. So part of this training is also to help people practice these skills. So if, for example, I know I'm going to have a tricky, difficult conversation with somebody in a facility that I'm inspecting, it's not enough to say to your staff person, oh, you'll be fine, you'll handle it. You might want to say, well, let's think about what could happen. Let's role play it. Let's give you some skills. Let's give you some techniques. Let's help you mentally rehearse how you're going to manage this when you deal with it. And then that does two things. Firstly, you anticipate it so it's no longer unexpected or unknown. And secondly, you have this memory of doing it well. And let me just stop here for a second to say this is why it's so important to reflect when things go well. Because once I reflect and I know, well, when I did this, this happened, or I had an experience of managing a difficult conversation, then I have that stored in my memory, and it helps me connect to that source of strength in myself. And then we shape the path. So there's lots of ways we can do that. So this is basically about making the path. If the path is wide and poorly defined, it's easy for that elephant to sort of go off, and we get distracted and we get tired. So there's several things we can do. The first is that we can tweak the environment. So if I want people to be more physically active at work, I can have them do standing desks. If I want situations in which I want people to be very, very actively engaged and listening, I may tweak the environment by simply saying, could we all agree to leave our cell phones off the table? And we do this. We literally do this in some of the meetings that I attend, that will say this is a technology-free meeting, because then we're saying it's harder to get distracted by your cell phone if your cell phone is in your office or in your purse. We can also do things like, if you want people to drink water, you have water nearby. If you want people to be able to very quickly enter something into a data system or record information, if you can make the process of entering that data and retrieving that data efficient and easy, that may make the managing of your data, which is so crucial to OHCQ, important. We also then build habits. And building habits, I think you know these in terms of getting your life together. So how many of us always hang our car keys in the same place? How many of us always put our ID badges in the same place? How many of us know that the first thing I'm going to do is say to check my email, and then I'm going to check in on so-and-so? We have built a series of habits, and these help us because when we start getting distracted or veering off, these habits are basically saying, this is the road we're walking, this is what we need to do. And so you'll hear, many effective writers will say, I always write at the same time or in the same place. I know that if I have to have a challenging conversation with somebody, I know that one of the habits that I have developed is to do two things: to take some time to think about what might happen in that conversation, what the other person might be feeling, needing, wanting. So I sort of ask myself a lot of questions about what a good outcome would be for this meeting. But I also take the time before the meeting to ground myself with just a few moments of mindfulness, of mindful pause, to down-regulate the anxiety that I might feel for the conversation. Now, this looks like we're talking about the elephant and the emotional piece of it, but the habit is the structure of how you approach those conversations. And then the other part of shaping a path is to say, who's going with us on this journey? So if I'm a single person having to lead change when nobody else wants to go there, so all the other elephants are like, we don't want to go there. Part of helping shape the path is by getting people to be motivated and engaged and committed to this same journey. It's always easier when you're not traveling alone. The other thing we need to do is to create an expectation of success. So if people are afraid of failure, how do we create an expectation of success? And what you see on the slides are an example of 4 grade options that a very creative educator introduced. She was working with children who had a history of failure, who didn't succeed, who were sure that they weren't smart enough. They had this not enough scarcity background conversation going on. Like, oh no, I can't learn this, I can't learn this. And what this high school principal did, no, I don't think it was a high school, I think it was an earlier school, maybe middle. And what she did was she said, these are the grades that you can get at this school: an A, a B, a C, or an NY. And what do you think NY stands for? Not yet. Not yet. So you're not getting a C if you deserved an F, but children weren't failed. They were like, you need to learn this, it's important, we're going to support you in growing and learning it, but you're not quite there yet. But when we say you're not there yet, you've created the expectation that they will arrive at that goal and they will arrive at the destination. So even if the change we hope for doesn't get achieved immediately and it's not perfect, we need to realize that we have to take the F grade off the table when we're talking about change. So even if the one we thought was the solution is not the solution, it's like, well, we haven't got the right solution yet. Right? We didn't fail, we just haven't got the right solution yet. So here's the summary, and you will have a handout of that. So I'm not going to read the slide to you again, but there's a summary of the rider, elephant, and path steps of the switch framework. So now I'd like you to just take a few moments, and you can decide how long that's going to be, to talk about how could changing our perspective about the change process enhance our understanding of how to lead positive change. So now we know what bad change felt like. We've seen how we can think about change. Now, as leaders, think about if we look to change not just like something else that we have to do for someone, somebody else's change or somebody else's issue or something that's big and complicated, if we rethought the way we approach change based on this switch model, how would that help us lead positive change? I'm not going to debrief that for you because I'm not here to give you advice or give you answers or tell you that your insights were great, because if they're your insights, they're valuable. But what I want to do to wrap this little module up is to point you to many free resources and podcasts on the Heath Brothers websites. They have them for different settings, for the social sector. They have them for personal change. They have them for all sorts of things. They have handouts. They have links. And they have all sorts of resources. And so I hope that you will take this opportunity to explore this framework and put it to work for you, whatever that work is that you do.